Welcome to Historica. Join me as we explore fascinating stories from the past and uncover hidden truths. Welcome to the first episode of a two-part podcast that delves into one of the most complex and long-standing conflicts of our time. A conflict that has shaped the lives of millions in the Middle East and echoes far beyond its borders. Today, we'll dive into the history, the events, and the underlying tensions that continue to influence the region, offering insights that are essential for understanding its present and future. On October 7, 2023, the world turned its attention to a region where even the name is a source of contention. For Israelis, it's Eretz Israel, while for Palestinians, it's Palestine. On that day, Hamas launched its operation called Al-Aqsa Flood. As a result, around 200 Israelis, mostly civilians, lost their lives, and 240 were kidnapped. Many of them have still not returned home. In response, Israel launched its Operation Iron Swords, which so far has led to the deaths of over 30,000 Palestinians, about one-third of whom are children. But this conflict didn't begin in October. As UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres reminded us, while condemning Hamas's attacks, Palestinians have lived under a 56-year-long occupation since Israel's victory in the Six-Day War of 1967. However, the roots of this situation go much deeper. To truly understand how we got here, we need to go back another 100 years to the late 19th century, when Jewish settlers first began arriving in these lands. This history, much like the conflict itself, is filled with varying perspectives, and for decades it has been clouded by political interests and deep emotions on both sides. In this podcast, I will take you on a journey through the key events, figures, and processes that have shaped this region and led to the situation we know today. From the arrival of the first Jewish settlers, through the establishment of the State of Israel, to the modern-day events. It's a complex story, full of pain, hope, and the struggle for survival, but also one that's worth understanding to better grasp what's happening today. Chapter 1: Birth of Conflict. The story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict dates back to the late 19th century, when Palestine was under Ottoman control, a rule that began in 1516. By the end of the 19th century, approximately 500,000 people lived in Palestine, predominantly Muslims, with significant Christian and Jewish minorities. Travelers and diplomats referred to this land as Palestine, and its people as Palestinians. They spoke Arabic and had their own traditions. During the 1830s and late 19th century, Palestine began to change with the rise of nationalism. The urban Palestinian elite started to revive interest in Arabic literature and culture, laying the groundwork for a national identity based on a shared language. Alongside the emergence of a modern Palestinian identity, a cultural renaissance took shape involving writers and poets. It's important to note that Palestine was never a land without a people, as some Zionists later claimed. Zionism began to emerge in Palestine by the end of the 19th century. Rooted in European sentiments, this movement was partly inspired by anti-Semitic attitudes in Europe, prompting Jews to seek a safe haven. Initially, Zionism did not gain widespread support among Jews. Many believed that changes in Europe would end their persecution. However, the Holocaust, which claimed the lives of over 6 million Jews, dramatically shifted this perspective, leading to a surge in support for Zionism as a movement promising security. Zionism also drew inspiration from European nationalism. as many nations under imperial rule sought independence. Jewish intellectuals viewed Zionism as a way to modernize Jewish identity, focusing on reviving the Hebrew language and asserting Jewish claims to Palestine, based on historical ties. The first group of Zionists arrived in Palestine in 1882. Despite lacking agricultural experience, they relied on local farmers for guidance. However, they held a vision for Palestine that diverged from the existing local communities. By the end of Ottoman rule in 1918, Jews made up about 5 to 6% of the Palestinian population, but were a well-organized minority. Zionists in Europe began diplomatic efforts to gain support, particularly from the British government. This led to the Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which the British promised to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. In 1922, the League of Nations formally placed Palestine under British mandate, with the British committing to facilitate Jewish immigration. However, managing Palestine proved challenging, as local resistance to Zionist plans grew. Despite initial attempts at cooperation, Palestinians rejected British proposals for partition. Chapter 2: Echoes of Silence, 1918 to 1926. During the British occupation of Palestine from 1918 to 1920, Palestinian thinkers and activists began organizing to fight for self-governance and oppose the Balfour Declaration, which promised a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Without any Palestinian input, they formed Muslim Christian associations, uniting under the Arab Congress of Palestine in 1919. This early movement challenges two prevalent myths: that the conflict is merely between Muslims and Jews, and that Palestine lacked a national identity before 1948. In fact, Christian Palestinians played a vital role, exemplified by the founding of the newspaper Palestine in 1911, which warned of Zionist ambitions. The Arab Congress represented a diverse Palestinian identity, demonstrating unity across religious divides. During the Paris Peace Conference in early 1919, they rejected the Balfour Declaration and envisioned Palestine as part of an independent Arab Syria. However, the British response was to establish institutions that divided Palestinians along religious lines. The Supreme Muslim Council, created in December 1921, sought to oversee Muslim affairs, but could not fully suppress the political engagement of Muslims in the Palestinian cause, with Hajj Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, emerging as a prominent leader. Initially, Palestinians hoped for cooperation with the British towards independence, but events quickly soured these aspirations. In April 1920, a right-wing Zionist group led by Ze'ev Jabotinsky marched through Jerusalem's Muslim quarter, escalating tensions. This was compounded by provocative calls in the Hebrew press for building a third Jewish temple on the Temple Mount, which could threaten the Haram al-Sharif, Islam's third holiest site. Such actions ignited violent clashes between Arabs and Jews, deepening divisions in the region. Palestinians organized to oppose the Balfour Declaration through various means. In May 1921, violence erupted in Jaffa during Labor Day demonstrations, when Jewish settlers marched through Palestinian neighborhoods, leading to deadly confrontations. This marked the beginning of ongoing violence, signaling that peace in Palestine was increasingly untenable amid growing colonization. A relative calm followed until 1929, which allowed Zionists to strengthen their presence and lay the groundwork for a future state, often at the expense of the Palestinian population. The British administration facilitated Zionist infrastructure development while neglecting Palestinian needs. Jewish settlers established their own educational systems, industries, and military capabilities, creating a nascent state within Palestine. In contrast, the British imposed their education system on Palestinians, who received inadequate healthcare and limited resources for higher education. While the Jewish community thrived with institutions like the Hebrew University, Palestinians were left with only a single teacher training school, which became a vital educational hub. By 1925, this school prepared students for exams that enabled them to study abroad, producing many skilled professionals who could have formed the Palestinian governing elite, had it not been for the catastrophic events of 1948. Additionally, the British quietly allowed the Zionist movement to establish the Haganah, a paramilitary group, fostering Palestinian resentment as they were denied the ability to organize or arm themselves. Despite this tension, the early 1920s saw moments of cooperation, with Arab and Jewish workers participating in joint strikes in Haifa and establishing numerous businesses together. This period, however, came to an end as the character of the Zionist movement evolved, leading to a more aggressive stance toward the Palestinian people. Chapter 3: Palestine's Transformation, the Zionist Movement. In the mid-1920s, the Zionist movement underwent a significant transformation. No longer content with seeking a safe homeland through the goodwill of larger powers, it began actively colonizing Palestine, often at the expense of the indigenous population. This period, while rarely acknowledged, set the stage for the conflicts to come. By 1926, changes in land ownership laws, established during the Ottoman reforms, allowed wealthy individuals to claim land easily. Many Palestinian farmers, who had cultivated their land for generations but lacked official documentation, found themselves classified as tenants, subject to eviction by absentee landlords. In 1920, the British administration lifted many restrictions on land purchases, enabling the Zionist movement to acquire land with increasing ease. For example, between 1921 and 1925, the American Zionist community bought 80,000 acres in Marj Ibn Amr, and by 1929, the Jewish National Fund had acquired significant land in Wadi Hawarith. This land was often forcibly taken from Palestinian farmers, marking the beginnings of ethnic cleansing in Palestine, a process that would extend for decades. This expansion of Zionist settlements represented a pivotal shift in the character of Zionism. It transitioned from a movement aimed at preserving Jewish identity to a colonial project focused on dominating another nation. Settler colonialism, as opposed to classical colonialism, aims to replace indigenous populations entirely, while classical colonialism seeks to transform locals into loyal subjects. Settler colonialism regards them as obstacles to be removed. In Australia, for instance, this approach led to the massacre of indigenous peoples. Settlers often erase the histories and cultures of the populations they displace, viewing the land as empty and available for their use. The late scholar Patrick Wolfe described this mindset as the logic of elimination. As long as Israel continues to embody this ethos, peaceful coexistence with Palestinians remains impossible. Settler colonial actions are not random. They come with ideological justifications that are propagated in various forms, including art. Early Zionist painters often depicted the landscape of their future homeland, conveniently erasing Palestinian villages to create a desired fantasy. Zionist justifications for their actions included dehumanizing the indigenous population, often labeling them as savages or nomads. This narrative disregarded the fact that many Palestinian villages had existed for centuries. Settlers presented themselves as modernizers, focusing on transforming the land rather than the people, whom they viewed merely as obstacles. Even today, myths persist that portray Palestine as a barren land. Prior to Zionist arrival, a narrative echoed by figures like Ursula von der Leyen, who recently celebrated Israel's accomplishments while ignoring the rich history of the land and its inhabitants. Zionist leaders, well aware of the indigenous population, discussed strategies for relocating Palestinians, even before the 1920s. Some hoped for voluntary emigration with compensation, while others considered forced relocation as an option. By 1948, these ideas had solidified into a master plan, leading to the displacement of half the Palestinian Arab population. As the 1920s closed, tensions between Jewish settlers and Palestinians escalated, leading to increased violence in the following decade. Dispossessed Palestinians, forced to abandon their farms, migrated to cities, often becoming victims of the socialist Zionist groups, which sought to limit agricultural work to Jews only. Even Jewish employers opposed this, recognizing the value of experienced Palestinian workers, but they were often shamed into compliance. Consequently, many landless Palestinians sought work in urban areas, marking a shift in their socio-economic landscape. Chapter 4. The Al-Buraq Revolution, 1929 to 1936. In 1929, Palestinians experienced an event that would later be known as the Al-Buraq Revolution. Thawrat al-Buraq. Al-Buraq, in Islamic tradition, is a winged creature that transported the Prophet Muhammad from Mecca to Jerusalem and then to the heavens. For Jews, this was simply referred to as a riot. Similar to the disturbances in 1920, tensions flared again in Jerusalem's Old City. Starting in the fall of 1928, Zionist groups began to challenge Muslim control over access to the Holy Mount, or Haram al-Sharif. On August 15, 1929, demonstrations organized by Haganah and revisionist Zionists, inspired by Vladimir Jabotinsky, sparked counter-demonstrations among Muslims the following day. Rumors and provocations led to violence, culminating in the deaths of 17 Jews after Friday prayers on August 23rd. This incident ignited a chain reaction of chaos, resulting in the deaths of 133 Jews and 116 Palestinians within a week, with violence spreading to other cities, including a brutal massacre in Hebron. Hebron's Jewish community, a small minority in Palestine, long before the rise of Zionism, had coexisted peacefully with Muslims, both groups honoring the city as a holy site, home to the tomb of the revered prophet Abraham. However, young Zionists, dressed in modern European attire, were seen as unwelcome newcomers. As news of the unrest in Jerusalem reached Hebron, Muslims from surrounding villages flocked to the city. In the end, 67 Jews lost their lives, though some found refuge in sympathetic Muslim homes. Today, the Hebron massacre serves as a haunting reminder, exploited in Israeli narratives to argue that coexistence is impossible, ironically justifying later massacres of Palestinians. While the immediate spark of the events in 1929 was religious conflict, the riots quickly escalated into a broader crisis, as Palestinians watched their social order unravel. This was an eruption of frustration after a decade of Zionist progress. Palestinians could see what awaited them: ethnic cleansing and deliberate impoverishment. As many Palestinians were forced to leave agricultural work, slums began to emerge. In the slums of Haifa in northern Palestine, a new form of Palestinian resistance to Zionism and its British collaborators began to take shape: guerrilla warfare. During this time, a charismatic preacher, Imam Izz al-Din al-Qassam, emerged as a pivotal figure. You may recognize his name. The military wing of Hamas is named after him, as are their early rockets. However, many secular Palestinian resistance groups also honor his legacy, as he introduced guerrilla warfare tactics into the Palestinian struggle against British rule. Born in Syria in 1882, Al-Qassam fought against French colonial forces during the 1919-20 uprising. Recognized as a threat, he was sentenced to death by the French. By the end of 1920, he fled to Haifa, where he preached at the Istiklal Mosque, still standing today, and taught at a Muslim school, quickly gaining respect. Al-Qassam inspired young Muslims living in the Haifa slums to form their own paramilitary groups to prepare for a protracted struggle against British colonialism. However, facing an influx of Jewish immigrants and increasing British surveillance, he was forced to act sooner than planned. In November 1935, Al-Qassam and 11 others defended themselves for hours against much larger British forces in the mountains near Jenin before they were killed. The next day, Haifa erupted in a general strike. You can visit his grave near the Jewish town of Nesha, which was then called Balad al-Sheikh. His death sparked a growing number of young Palestinians to take up arms and prepare for battle against the British, demanding an end to their Zionist policies. It also fostered greater unity among Palestinian political leadership, previously divided along family lines between the Husseinis and Nashashibis. Although Al-Qassam's military uprising ultimately failed, it laid the groundwork for a more organized resistance that would emerge in the late 1930s. Chapter 5: The Arab Revolt, 1936 to 1939. After the events of 1929, the British recognized the complex conflict in Palestine, caught between two nations with competing promises. As violence escalated, they established two investigative commissions. The first, led by Sir Walter Shaw, revealed that the unrest stemmed from Zionist actions aimed at dispossessing Palestinian farmers, alongside the Palestinians' fundamental opposition to Zionism. A second investigation by Sir John Hope Simpson echoed these findings, recommending limits on Jewish immigration. Initially, the British government took these recommendations seriously, leading to Lord Passfield's White Paper in 1930, which sought to restrict Zionist land purchases and immigration, highlighting the negative impact on Arab unemployment. However, the emergence of a powerful pro-Zionist lobby pressured the British to retract these commitments. Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, responding to Chaim Weizmann's influence, effectively reversed the policy, stoking Palestinian grievances. as Palestinian attempts to sway British policy through petitions and demonstrations yielded no results between 1930 and 1936. The Arab Higher Committee decided to take more assertive action. They called for a national strike against Jewish immigration and land purchases, which escalated into a full-scale revolt against British and Jewish forces by 1936. The British responded brutally, employing air raids and collective punishment tactics, reminiscent of contemporary conflicts. In a shocking display of force, they blew up over 200 buildings in Jaffa, displacing thousands of Palestinians. After 3 years of suppression, the uprising was finally quelled. In the wake of the revolt, the British sent the Peel Commission in 1937 to explore a resolution. This commission suggested partitioning Palestine into a small Jewish state alongside Jordan, proposing the relocation of around 250,000 Palestinians. Unsurprisingly, the Arab Higher Committee rejected this proposal outright. However, David Ben-Gurion, a leader of the Zionist movement, saw an opportunity. He considered accepting the small territory offered, believing it would not prevent future expansion. Ben-Gurion was already contemplating the relocation of Palestinians, anticipating that the British would not assist in this endeavour. When Britain dispatched the Woodhead Commission in 1938, it dismissed the Peel proposal as unfeasible, stressing that any partition would require massive displacement of Palestinians. They suggested a different solution: a small Jewish state, a larger Palestinian state, and key territories under British mandate. This revealed the difficulty of imposing a Jewish state without significant injustice to the Palestinians. By 1939, Britain published a new white paper, affirming that it had fulfilled its obligations under the Balfour Declaration, with the settlement of over 450,000 Jews. The proposal suggested creating an independent state in 10 years, jointly governed by Palestinians and Jews, while restricting Jewish immigration for 5 years. The response was widespread disappointment. Zionists rejected it outright, and Palestinians found it inadequate. As World War II began, Britain strategically maintained a firm stance against Jewish immigration into Palestine despite the desperate pleas of those fleeing Nazi persecution. The horrors of the Holocaust intensified Zionist aspirations. In May 1942, Zionist leaders declared their goal of establishing a Jewish state across all historical Palestine, sensing that support from the United States was pivotal for their cause. By this time, Palestinians were struggling to regain their political footing. Their leadership, weakened and often exiled, could not match the Zionist lobbying power. In Britain or the US, the most notable figure among them, Haj Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, had been driven into exile. In contrast, the Zionist movement thrived, advocating for a de-Arabized Palestine, emboldened by the shifting political landscape. After the Holocaust, with over 6 million Jews lost, European powers felt a moral obligation to support the establishment of a Jewish homeland. The plight of the Palestinians became overshadowed in this broader narrative, leaving their future uncertain as the world grappled with the aftermath of the war. Chapter 6. The Path to Nakba, 1945 to 1948. Between the end of World War II and the British departure from Palestine in 1948, 3 key processes unfolded, culminating in the Nakba, the catastrophe for the Palestinian people, and the establishment of Israel. Diplomatic stalemates, 1945. 1947. In 1945, Britain sought a solution to the escalating conflict between Palestinian Arabs and Jewish settlers. They formed the Anglo-American Committee, tasked with proposing a resolution before the mandate ended. Their report, while thorough, failed to suggest anything new, proposing instead an extended British oversight over both communities, which both sides swiftly rejected. By early 1947, Britain realized they could no longer uphold their promise from the Balfour Declaration, and the growing discontent and violent actions from militant Zionist groups like Irgun added urgency to the situation. In February 1947, Britain referred the issue to the newly formed United Nations, which, lacking experience in resolving complex conflicts, appointed a special committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, to assess the situation. UNSCOP recommended partitioning Palestine in September 1947. The Palestinian leadership, represented by the Arab Higher Committee, boycotted the committee's processes, asserting their right to independence should not be negotiated. They recognized that the Zionist agenda aimed to secure as much land as possible with as few Palestinians as feasible. Diplomatic efforts ultimately failed, as the UN could not justify why Palestine should be treated differently from other nations seeking self-determination. The Arab world's response. 1945-1947. In solidarity with Palestine, the Arab League, formed in 1945, rejected the UNSCOP recommendations except for Transjordan. The divergence stemmed from historical ties. Transjordan's King Abdullah had established connections with the Jewish Agency, which aimed to secure a Jewish state in return for potential territorial expansion into Palestine. The Arab League sought to uphold the principles of democracy and self-determination. After the partition proposal was accepted by the UN, the League began preparing a volunteer army, the Arab Liberation Army, ready to intervene if diplomatic avenues failed. Zionist preparations. 1945-1947. In contrast, the Zionist movement was poised to capitalize on the impending end of the mandate. They viewed the British departure as an opportunity to assert control over Palestine. Having demanded an end to the mandate since 1942. As tensions mounted, the Zionist leadership worked diligently to establish their administrative presence across critical infrastructure, such as communication and transportation networks. By late 1947, the UN was set to make a crucial decision regarding Palestine's future. On November 29th, the General Assembly voted for Resolution 181, supporting the partition of Palestine. For Zionists, it marked the long-awaited establishment of a Jewish state. For Palestinians, it was the beginning of Nakba, a harbinger of a catastrophe still felt today. Chapter 7. Geopolitical Maneuvering and Partition, 1947. Before delving into the impact of the partition resolution on the ground, we must closely examine the geopolitical maneuvering at the UN. The United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, comprised of 11 member states, struggled to reach a consensus on Palestine's future. They ultimately produced two proposals: a minority plan advocating for a binational federal state, and a majority plan for partition. The minority plan called for a federal state, divided into Arab and Jewish nations, allowing Jewish immigration only into the Jewish region. Supported by only India, Iran, and Yugoslavia, this plan never gained traction. The majority proposal, however, suggested partitioning Palestine into two states, 56% for a Jewish state and 43% for a Palestinian state, with Jerusalem as an international enclave. This plan aimed for economic cooperation and shared citizenship between the two states. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted on the majority proposal, with 33 states in favour, 13 against, and 10 abstentions. The Zionist movement narrowly achieved a two-thirds majority, a crucial step toward international recognition of a Jewish state. The US and USSR, despite being rival powers, both supported the partition plan. The USSR, seeking to weaken British influence in the region, facilitated Jewish emigration from its territories to Palestine. Meanwhile, the US government, driven by a strong Zionist lobby, pressured hesitant states into supporting the resolution, despite skepticism from the State Department about its impact on US interests in the region. The British government, wary of a strong Palestinian state led by Haj Amin al-Husseini, sought to bolster King Abdullah of Transjordan by proposing territorial annexations. They encouraged Abdullah to ally with Zionist leaders, creating a divide that would help limit Arab military efforts against the impending Jewish state. The complacency of the international community and the curious alliances formed at the UN laid the groundwork for significant unrest. Jewish settlers celebrated the news of partition, while Palestinians felt excluded from the self-determination that had been promised to them. Protests erupted across Palestine, some turning violent. Despite an initial calm, both communities prepared for impending conflict. As tensions escalated, Palestinians attempted to form their own defense groups in response to the growing strength of the Zionist paramilitary organizations, Haganah, Irgun, and the Stern Gang. However, many Palestinian leaders had been imprisoned or killed during previous uprisings, leaving them with limited resources and poorly trained volunteers. The Arab League pledged support but withheld regular troops until after the British mandate ended on May 14, 1948. This delay left Palestinians at a significant disadvantage against the better equipped and more numerous Zionist forces. The international community, committed to justice and equal rights, had inadvertently paved the way for a catastrophe. This disaster would be known in Arabic as Nakba, marking a pivotal moment in the history of Palestine. Chapter 8. The Road to Partition, 1947 to 1949. As the timeline for British withdrawal was established, and the UN proposed partition as a solution to the escalating conflict, the Zionist leadership, led by David Ben-Gurion, began plotting their next moves. They were determined to establish dominance in the territory, designated for the Jewish state, where nearly half the population was Palestinian. From the moment the UN voted for partition, it was clear that the Palestinians and the broader Arab world would reject this plan. Anticipating conflict, Ben-Gurion and his advisors prepared for a war that would allow them to seize not only the Jewish state, but also territories meant for the Palestinian Arab state. Between February 1947 and February 1948, this small group gathered strength, believing their careful planning would soon bear fruit. They devised a two-pronged approach to ensure Jewish dominance. First, they exploited Palestinian anger towards the partition plan. When violence erupted, they retaliated with collective punishment, using Palestinian attacks as a pretext to begin what can only be described as ethnic cleansing. A notable example occurred in February 1948, when 3 villages near Caesarea were violently cleared, leaving little trace of the thriving communities that had existed there. Initially, these actions were framed as defensive responses to Palestinian aggression. However, by the end of February 1948, the tactics shifted to mass expulsions, moving away from any notion of self-defense. The intensifying violence captured the attention of the US State Department, which had been skeptical of Zionist colonization efforts. The UN Partition plan appeared increasingly unfeasible, prompting the US to suggest a 5-year international trusteeship for Palestine. The Zionist movement reacted furiously, quickly mobilizing its powerful US lobby, leading to a swift reversal of American hesitations. Plan D. As the US wavered, the Zionist leadership pressed on with their strategy. On March 10, 1948, Ben-Gurion and military generals created what would become known as Plan Dalet, Plan D. Its objective was clear: to remove as many Palestinians as possible and forge a Jewish majority state. The execution was brutal, surrounding villages, allowing residents a path to flee, and then demolishing homes to prevent return. In this chilling plan, Palestinians could escape expulsion only by unconditional surrender. Yet many were destined for forced removal regardless. The operational orders included harrowing instructions for targeting young men, often labeled as potential threats. During the spring of 1948, urban centers like Haifa, Jaffa, and Acre fell victim to these tactics. On April 9th, the infamous attack on Deir Yassin by paramilitary groups resulted in the massacre of over 100 villagers. The surrounding population fled in fear, anticipating similar violence would befall their communities. The Arab world's response. By the end of the British Mandate in May 1948, around 250,000 Palestinians were already refugees, straining Arab governments to take action. Yet, due to their own struggles and a lack of coordinated military force, significant intervention came too late. Arab armies, such as the Egyptian and Jordanian forces, had mixed results and motivations. King Abdullah of Jordan engaged in secret negotiations with the Zionist leadership, leading to a passive approach in many regions. The Egyptian army, lacking professionalism and coordination, struggled to make an impact. Consequently, the Arab effort to halt the ethnic cleansing failed, with Israel gaining control over most of Palestine and displacing half of its Arab population by the end of the year. Amid the chaos, Israel systematically erased traces of Palestinian existence. The expelled populations were pushed into neighboring countries and crowded into makeshift camps. Notably the Gaza Strip, once a vibrant city, now reduced to a refugee camp. The first failed attempt at peace. As the world watched, the UN appointed Count Volker Bernadotte to mediate peace. His proposal, which called for a revised partition plan and the right of return for refugees, was rejected by Zionist leaders. Tragically, he was assassinated in September 1948, a grim testament to the resistance against diplomatic efforts. In December 1948, the UN passed Resolution 194, affirming the right of return for refugees and seeking a negotiated two-state solution. However, negotiations stalled as Israel disavowed the terms of agreements made during the Lausanne Conference in 1949. Instead, Israel prioritized establishing its borders, leading to further displacement and the creation of refugee camps for Palestinians that persist to this day. Thus, the Nakba was not merely about land acquisition. It was an attempt to obliterate Palestinian identity and unity, scattering communities across various nations and complicating the prospect of a cohesive national movement. End of Part 1. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you found it insightful, please consider subscribing to the channel to stay up to date with future episodes. Should you have any feedback or thoughts to share, feel free to leave a comment or contact me directly. I'd greatly appreciate your input.